She came up to me one day and gave me the worst news any atheist husband could get. She said, I've become a Christian. And I thought, I got to get my marriage back together here. How do I do that? Well, wait a minute. There's an easy way. All I have to do is disprove Christianity. I didn't believe, and I thought it was fairy tales. I thought it was make-believe. I thought Christianity was based on wishful thinking, mythology and legend. That's what I thought. But as I began to investigate the resurrection, I was stunned because I did not expect there to be any historical validity. And I thought, I believe based on the data of history. So I got on my knees and I poured out a confession.
But I want to get into a little bit about what sent you on the journey to disprove the Bible.
Yeah.
Or God.
Well, I was legal editor of the Chicago Tribune and got married young, and I was an atheist. My wife was an agnostic. She didn't know what to believe, and she came up to me one day and gave me the worst news any atheist husband could get. She said, I've become a Christian. I thought, oh, great. Now she's going to start judging me. Now she's going to try to get me not to hang out with my friends. Now she's going to make the kids think that there's something wrong with me because I don't believe in God. I thought, I just saw trouble on the horizon. And trouble came because all of a sudden she becomes a devout Christian and I'm an adamant atheist. Well, we're just butting heads. And we'd never done that. We met when we were 14. We got married at 19 and 20. We're best friends. And yet for the first time in our marriage, we're at loggerheads. She wants to go to church. Well, am I going to stay home with the kids while you go to church? I got other things to do. I remember when she came to me, she said, I'd like to give some money to the church. I said, I got a good idea. Why don't you take the money and flush it down the toilet? Because that'll have the same effect. So that was what she was up against. And I thought, I got to get my marriage back together here. How do I do that? Well, wait a minute. There's an easy way. All I have to do is disprove Christianity. I went to Yale Law School. I understand what evidence is. Take me a long weekend, maybe a 3-day weekend, and I'm sure I can poke enough holes in Christianity that it would fall apart.
What brought your wife to faith?
It's interesting. We moved into a condo in suburban Chicago, and the doorbell rang, and it was a neighbor. It was a woman. She was a nurse, and her name was Linda, and she had a child on her hip who was 6 months old. Well, we had a 9-month-old daughter, and so Linda introduces herself, brought a plate of cookies, and said, hey, let's get together sometime. So they became best friends. Well, Linda was a Christian, a strong Christian, and they would have long conversations about God. And Leslie wasn't hostile like I was. She just had questions like anybody would, and Linda had answers. And she went to church with her. She checked it out. And then she brought me that news that she had become a Christian.
And that just enraged you.
Oh, my gosh. I just saw, this is the last thing I need in my life. Because I just had this caricature of Christians who were going to be judgmental and going to look down their nose at me. And by the way, I thought I was the man in her life. Now who's this Jesus character?
Well, you weren't wrong.
Yeah.
I do see a lot of those things that you just described still today, and I'd love to chat about that later on.
I know. There is a lot of that, and that's what I was recoiling against. And so I thought I could disprove it. I ended up spending a year and 9 months taking my journalism training, my legal training, and probing the historical data concerning the resurrection of Jesus mainly. Because even as an atheist, I understood everything depends on whether Jesus returned from the dead or not. Because clearly, Jesus made transcendent and messianic and divine claims about himself. He claimed he was the Son of God. At one point, he gets up before a group of people, and he says, I and the Father are one. And the word in Greek there for one is not masculine, it's neuter. which means Jesus was not saying I and the Father are the same person. He was saying I and the Father are the same thing. We're one in nature. We're one in essence. And the audience got it. They said, oh, you're a man and you're claiming to be God. So they were going to kill him for claiming to be God. Well, he claimed to be God, but so what? I could claim to be God. Well, maybe not you. Anybody could claim that they're God. But if Jesus claimed to be God, died, and then 3 days later rose from the dead, that's pretty good evidence he's telling the truth. So even as an atheist, I recognize this is the ball game. And if I could just disprove it, I'd be home free. I could rescue her from this cult and go on with our life as it was.
Where do you start to disprove something?
It's so funny you ask that because this is back in 1980 or so when you're at the library with microfiche and microfilm and you're doing interlibrary loans that take 4 months to get an ancient book out of the library. You're going to museums to look at manuscripts. But I was trained to investigate. I was an investigative reporter for the Chicago Tribune. I did major investigations. I did a lot of the original reporting on the Ford Pinto case, which is before your time, but it was a big deal back then. So I knew to pick up the phone and call a scholar and say, I'm Lee Strobel from the Chicago Tribune. Oh, he probably thought I'm working on an article. And say, hey, I got a question for you. What about this? Oh, okay. Well, great, thanks. So I just began calling people, researching history, checking stuff out. And nowadays, it's a lot easier. Nowadays, it's very easy to investigate this stuff. One of the greatest scholars, probably the greatest scholar on the resurrection, Dr. Gary Habermas, is writing a 4 or 5 volume set. Each volume is like 800 pages or so on the resurrection. All refuting every counter argument out there and presenting the case affirmatively and so forth. And so there's plenty of stuff out there now if someone wants to check it out. I ended up writing a book on it called The Case for Christ. When I did the book, I needed to retrace a lot of these interviews that I did because I wasn't planning to write a book. I didn't keep notes. This is for me, my curiosity, like you. I had a bunch of questions. But then when I wrote the book, of course, I had to do in-depth interviews, tape record them, make sure they were accurate and so forth. And so that book really summarizes the evidence.
So earlier you had mentioned there was a passage, I think, did you say John 1:12?
Yeah.
That did it for you? Is that really, what is John 1:12?
Yeah, John 1:12 says it's not enough just to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. The Bible says demons believe that Jesus is God, and they shudder because they know the implications of it for them. It's not enough just to believe it. We have to receive this free gift of forgiveness and eternal life, this free gift of God's grace. And when we do that, John 1:12 says we become a child of God forever. Well, I didn't believe, and I thought it was fairy tales. I thought it was make-believe. I thought Christianity was based on wishful thinking, mythology and legend. That's what I thought. But as I began to investigate the resurrection, I was stunned because when I was a little kid, I don't know if you had this when you were a kid, my parents for Christmas gave me this punching clown. It was weighted on the bottom. It was about 3 feet tall, and it was inflated, and it was a clown. And you would hit it like a punching bag, and because it was weighted on the bottom, it would go down when you would hit it, but then it would bounce back up. And then you'd hit it again. It was a toy that I got when I was a kid. That's how I pictured this. I thought I had a knockdown punch. I thought I could disprove Christianity. So I'd hit it with an objection, and it would bounce back. There's an answer to that. Doggone it. What about this? Bang, I'd hit it again, and it would bounce back. There's an answer to that. So I was stunned because I did not expect there to be any historical validity to the fact that Jesus died on a cross and rose from the dead. But I can summarize it really quickly, what I found, using 4 words that begin with the letter E. That way people can remember. Because remember, it's Christmas. The reason Jesus came was Easter, the resurrection. How do we know it's true? 4 words that begin with the letter E. Execution. Jesus was dead after being crucified. I thought maybe he survived. and the cool, damp air of the tomb resuscitated him. That's what I thought. No, we have no record anywhere of anyone surviving a full Roman crucifixion, anywhere. Not only do we have multiple accounts in the documents of the New Testament that tell us that Jesus was dead after being crucified, we've got 5 ancient sources outside the Bible that talk about him being dead.
What are those sources?
Oh, like Josephus, Tacitus. These are early historians, Mirabar Serapion, Lucian. Even the Jewish Talmud admits that Jesus was executed. So Jesus was clearly dead. In fact, get this. The Journal of the American Medical Association, a secular, scientific, peer-reviewed medical journal, carried an investigation into the death of Jesus. And this was their conclusion, quote, "Clearly, the weight of the historical and medical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead even before the wound to his side was inflicted." So that's the Journal of the American Medical Association. You could go to an atheist New Testament scholar like Gerd Ludemann, and he will tell you the death of Jesus on the cross by crucifixion is historically indisputable. That's the atheist speaking. So the first E is for execution. Jesus was dead. The second E stands for early reports that he rose from the dead. In other words, reports that didn't come after decades of legendary development, but go right back to the cross itself. In other words, I used to think as a skeptic, okay, I got to give you the fact Jesus was dead, get it. But the resurrection is a legend. And I knew it took time for legend to develop in the ancient world. You know, the great historian A.N. Sherwin-White of Oxford said the passage of 2 generations of time is not even enough for legend to grow up and wipe out a solid core of historical truth. So I knew it took a few generations for legend to develop. Well, what I learned is that we have a report of the resurrection of Jesus, including named eyewitnesses and groups of eyewitnesses that said he died, why? For our sins. He was buried. On the 3rd day, he rose from the dead. And these eyewitnesses, groups of eyewitnesses and individuals, this report has been dated back by scholars to within months of his death.
Wow.
Within months. Yeah, wow. That's a newsflash.
You can see this.
It's in the Bible. 1 Corinthians 15, starting at verse 2. That is a nugget that talks about the resurrection of Jesus. Who wrote 1 Corinthians? Paul. Paul had been someone who didn't believe in God. He was a Pharisee. He didn't believe in Jesus. He was persecuting Christians. He's on the road to Damascus. Boom, he has this encounter with the risen Christ. He realizes Jesus is God, and he becomes the Apostle Paul. 22 years later, he writes his letter to the church in Corinth. That's what we call 1 Corinthians in the Bible. And he includes this report about the resurrection. Where did he get that report? Well, we know that it was 1 to 3 years after the death of Jesus that he had this experience with the risen Christ and became the Apostle Paul. He immediately went into Damascus and he met with some apostles. Many people believe that's when he was given this report about the resurrection. Some people believe it was a couple years later, he went to Jerusalem and he met for 15 days with 2 eyewitnesses to the resurrection who were mentioned in that report, Peter and James. And the Greek word that Paul uses to describe that meeting is this is an investigative meeting. They're checking each other out. What did you see? What do you know? What do you know for sure? What do you experience? Some people believe that's when he was given this report by 2 people named in the report. But either way, it means within 1 to 6 years after the death of Jesus, this creed, this report is already in existence, and therefore the beliefs that make up this report go back even earlier, virtually to the cross itself. So there's no huge time gap between the death of Jesus and the later development of a legend that he rose from the dead. We got a news flash, and probably the greatest historian on the first century is Dr. James D.G. Dunn of the United Kingdom. He analyzed this report, which comes in the form of a creed of the earliest church with eyewitnesses to the resurrection. He analyzed it historically, and here was his conclusion. He says, we can be entirely confident that this report was written originally within months of the death of Jesus, within months. That is a news flash from ancient history, much too quick to be a legend that developed over the generations. So we got an execution, he's dead. We got this early report, and we got other early reports right there. First generation, same generation of Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then John comes a little bit later, but also I would say in the first generation. So we've got these other reports too, but this one that I'm mentioning
is it the original report too?
What's that?
Is it the original documentation?
Well, he's reporting it in his letter to the church in Corinth.
Okay.
And that's what we have today.
But it is the original letter. Is it the original letter?
Well, the original letter's been turned to dust because
Okay.
it was written in parchment or on scrolls and papyrus and so forth.
Okay.
But we have people who copied it.
Gotcha.
And so we've got multiple copies. So we got an execution. We got the early report. Third E is empty tomb. And what's interesting about that is even the enemies of Jesus admitted the tomb was empty. How do we know? Because we know from history, sources inside and outside the Bible, that when the disciples began saying, oh, Jesus had been resurrected, what the enemies of Jesus said was, oh, well, the disciples stole his body. Think about that. That's a cover story. They're admitting the tomb is empty. They're just saying, this is how it got empty. They stole the body. So they're conceding implicitly that the tomb is empty. It's like if you're a student and a teacher comes up, if you're a teacher.
You mean the government lied?
Even in the first century. I can't believe that. But, if you're a teacher and a student comes up to you and says, the dog ate my homework, he's admitting he doesn't have his homework, but he's trying to explain what happened to it. It's the same thing. So even the enemies of Jesus admitted the tomb was empty. The disciples didn't have the motive, the means, or the opportunity to steal the body. Nobody did. And then we look at the fourth E, eyewitnesses. Most of what we accept as being true from the ancient world is based on maybe one source or two sources of information. When you get right down to it, we know things about famous people through ancient history because maybe one source or two sources. For the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the resurrected Jesus, we have no fewer than 9 ancient sources, inside and outside the New Testament, confirming and corroborating the conviction of the disciples that they encountered the risen Christ. That is an avalanche of historical data. So, I looked at this kind of stuff for almost 2 years.
Wow.
And, there's much more depth we could go into, but
let's go into it.
Yeah,
Let's go into some
yeah.
more.
Well, here's a fact that this was the final fact that convinced me. It was like I was putting together a jigsaw puzzle. I didn't know what the picture was going to be, and I got this final puzzle piece to go in, and when it went in, I stepped back and I saw it was a picture of Jesus. What was that puzzle piece? People would tell me, oh, the disciples really believed that Jesus appeared to them resurrected because they were willing to die for that conviction. And I would say, that doesn't convince me. So what? In World War II, kamikaze pilots crashed their airplanes into boats. Why? Because they thought if they died that way, they'd go to heaven. Today, why would a terrorist crash into the World Trade Center in an airplane and kill himself and a whole bunch of people? Because he sincerely believed with his whole heart, if he dies that way, he's going to paradise. So don't tell me that the disciples' willingness to die means anything. And then somebody clarified. They say, wait a minute. Let's use, I'm fast forwarding because this was before September 11th, but we use that as an illustration, the September 11th terrorist attacks. It's a huge difference between the terror attacks of September 11th and the disciples being willing to die for their convictions. The difference is those hijackers who hijacked the plane and crashed them into the World Trade Center did not know for a fact if they died that way, they go to heaven. They believed it with all their heart. They were taught it. They believed it. They had faith in it. And having faith in it, they were willing to die that way. That tells me nothing about the truth of their convictions. Now, let's think about the disciples. Of all human beings who've ever lived on the planet, they were in a unique position. They were there. They touched the resurrected Jesus. They talked with him. They ate with him. Of all people who ever lived, they knew the truth about whether he had returned from the dead and proved he's the Son of God, because they were there. They knew the truth. Knowing the truth, they were willing to die for it. That's the difference. And a light bulb went on. I said, whoa, I get it. That gives me confidence in what they were saying, because they were there, they touched them, they ate with them, they talked to them. They knew whether this was a lie. Somebody said to me, Lee, nobody knowingly and willingly dies for what they know is a lie. They knew if this was true or was a lie. They were willing to die for it. Why? Because they knew it was true.
Wow.
That was the last puzzle piece. It was November the 8th of 1981. It was a Sunday afternoon, about 3 p.m. And I thought, I believe, based on the data of history, that Jesus claimed to be God and backed it up by returning from the dead. But now what? Do I just go back to life? Because remember, the demons believe this too, and they shudder. And then my wife, Leslie, pointed out a verse to me, John 1:12. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name. And I looked at that and I thought, okay, I get the equation. Believe, I do, plus receive. Oh, that's what I have to do to become a child of God. So I got on my knees and I poured out a confession of a lifetime of immorality that would absolutely curl your hair. And at that moment, I received complete, total forgiveness through Jesus Christ, and I became a child of God. And I remember I went out and I told Leslie, and she burst into tears and she threw her arms around my neck and she said, I almost gave up on you 1,000 times. She said, when I was a new Christian, I told some women about you at church. I said, I don't have any hope for my husband. He is the hard-headed, hard-hearted legal editor of the Chicago Tribune. He's never going to bend his knee to Jesus. And this one elderly woman named Sylvia put her arm around Leslie's shoulder, pulled her to the side, and said, oh, Leslie, no one is beyond hope. And she gave her a verse from the Old Testament, Ezekiel 36:26. It says, moreover, I will give you a new heart, and I will put a new spirit within you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. And so what I never knew, that whole 2 years that I'm on this investigative journey, what I never knew at the time is my wife, every day on her knees in private, prayed that verse for me.